What's on your radar, Briahna?
Well, Robbie, today's is a doozy. Yesterday, for the first time in 100 years, the House majority couldn't decide on a speaker. In 3 rounds of voting, prospective leader, Representative Kevin McCarthy, fell short of the 218 votes needed to secure the speakership spot, losing votes rather than gaining them as the day wore on. Because the Republicans hold a narrow majority in the House, McCarthy can only lose about 4 of his own members. And as of the 3rd round of voting, he was 16 votes short of 218. Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio clinched 20 votes by the end of the day after consolidation in the 3rd round. But despite the historically rare nature of a failed speakership vote, yesterday was far from unexpected. First, because a vocal anti-McCarthy faction has been signaling its intent to not vote for McCarthy without significant concessions for weeks, as we've covered on this show. Second, because as many progressives know, we've been here before. In 2021, a movement known as Force the Vote advocated for progressives in the House to do precisely what this rogue faction of Republicans are doing now, but to do so because they could use their leverage to fight for the people. They declined to do so. Now, Republicans are showing how much power coalition politics can, in fact, garner. And despite major coping on social media with selfies and lame gags about eating popcorn from the left, while Republicans flail, it's so-called progressives who have egg on their face right now. The fact is that the rogue Republican plan to secure concessions from the Republican establishment is working. For example, McCarthy has agreed to a rule that would make it easier to oust a sitting speaker. The compromise package offered by McCarthy also includes a cut-go rule that would require any spending increases to be offset by cuts in mandatory spending. Note that military spending, of course, is generally exempt from these budget wars. There's never any how will we pay for it when we're talking about funding Ukraine, only when we're cutting your Medicare benefits or penny pinching over the cost of your insulin. But other asks include reopening the Capitol and getting rid of pandemic protocols. I don't want to spend too much time in the weeds here. What you need to know is this. A political faction of the Republican Party that objects to Kevin McCarthy on the admittedly vague grounds they've offered have identified that they, in fact, have real leverage to demand basically whatever they want. And the Republican establishment can't do anything about it. Now, some critics say this is stupid because the rogue Republicans have no plan for an alternative speaker, and that it's highly unlikely that Jim Jordan could possibly whip enough votes to present a credible challenge to McCarthy. Left establishment toadies made a similar argument in 2021, saying that the plan wasn't feasible absent a viable speaker candidate in the alternative to Nancy Pelosi. This week's events prove how idiotic that contention really was. The Republican defectors didn't need a specific alternative candidate to gum up the works. As long as they pick someone, anyone not named Kevin McCarthy, Republicans are stuck in limbo. Unless 29 Democrats walk or vote present, giving McCarthy a majority, or 11 Republicans walk or vote present, giving Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries a majority, Republicans are forced to negotiate for as long as it takes. Now, the longest speaker vote ever in 1856 took 2 months and 133 rounds of voting, which puts yesterday's 3 rounds in some perspective. And during that historical vote, which featured violent fistfights and a caning between congressmen, legislating came to a standstill. As Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is firmly in the pro-McCarthy camp, pointed out, we can't even swear in as members of Congress until we elect a speaker. We can't form committees until we elect a speaker. We can't investigate anything until we have a speaker. Heavens to Betsy, that sounds a lot like leverage to me. And isn't that the point? The entire Republican agenda is now in the hands of a handful of opportunistic Congress members. And Republicans are not quite sure what to do about it. Some McCarthy supporters are trying to paint this force the vote effort as a self-interested hostage-taking mission, ginning up antagonism against the rogue Republicans in the public eye and ultimately in their districts where they probably hope they feel it the most. Here's Representative Dan Crenshaw on Fox News yesterday.
Republicans have been waiting years for this opportunity to take over the House. And so when the rest of the country looks at how Republicans are handling day one, they can't unite, they can't come together. It's day one and they can't agree already.
Yeah, it's a shame. It makes us look foolish. If I didn't know any better, it's like the Democrats paid these people off. Hey, let's pay them off. Let's make it look like the Republicans can't govern and don't deserve any gavels whatsoever. That's what it makes it look like. Again, their demands are foolish. Their demands are inside baseball procedural issues. That's what they are. Their demands are things that the average American doesn't care about at all. The average American cares about defunding 87,000 IRS agents. That's actually what's going to be on the floor today if McCarthy gets 218. Because then we can actually start doing business. That's the first bill we're going to vote on. You know what's going to be right up after that? It's going to be bills on border security. It's going to be bills on making our economy more resilient and reducing inflation. It's going to be the things that people actually care about. The things that they want, the things that they're demanding to offer their votes to McCarthy are things that nobody cares about.
Right.
And look, nobody calls my office and says, you have to, this is my biggest priority. You've got to get rid of Kevin McCarthy.
Now, in that clip, Crenshaw is articulating what has become a very common refrain for Republicans, that these 20 or so obstructionists are standing in the way of substantive policy for the sake of administrative asks that don't matter to the voting public. He cites Republican plans to defund the IRS and secure the border as priorities that are getting stalled, and jokes that it's almost as if the Democrats paid Republicans to act this foolishly. He goes on to say that these rogue Republicans have no plan, and as I listen to him, I can't help but think, my God, he sounds an awful lot like establishment Democrats. Let me explain. In 2020, the situation was reversed. Democrats had a small majority in the House, such that a handful of progressives, squad members alone, had enough votes to hold up Nancy Pelosi's nomination to lead the House. There were plenty of reasons, by the way, to do so. For one, AOC had previously gestured to the fact that she found it incredible that Pelosi had never faced a real speakership challenge in all her years. Moreover, we were at the start of the COVID pandemic and at the tail end of a progressive presidential campaign that delivered unprecedented public support for Medicare for all, along with other progressive policies. Did Bernie's loss mean that the movement representing a majority of Americans was supposed to die? And during a pandemic at that. Since Trump was still president, Democrats were still pretending to care about COVID deaths. And before the vaccines, when even young and healthy people were finding themselves hospitalized or even dying from COVID, there was genuine energy around using the public health crisis as a springboard for improving our public health system, which, by the way, is the most expensive in the world, despite yielding worse results than peer nations. Disgruntled progressives who made up a significant part of the Democratic Party base had dutifully voted for Biden, despite warnings from folks like myself who said that doing so without establishing some conditions would mean that Biden would ultimately betray most, if not all, of his campaign promises. And in the weeks after the election, progressive YouTube Politico and comedian Jimmy Dore floated a simple idea to get something in return for those very progressive voters. An idea, in fact, that he gleaned from the DSA's own handbook. That is, you guessed it, force the vote. Progressive squad members could leverage their speakership vote to extract concessions from Nancy Pelosi. Now, unlike Republicans now, the left's asks were to be substantive, not just procedural. One key ask was a vote on Medicare for all, which was intended to keep the fight alive and draw a contrast between Democrats' claims that they want to improve health care for Americans and the fact that they repeatedly kill Medicare for all legislation as quickly as they receive money from the pharmaceutical industry. If you want to understand why the vote for Medicare for all was such an important ask, just look at what's happened over the last 2 years. Look at how California, with its Democratic supermajority legislature, killed a statewide Medicare for all bill, or consider how silent all of the squad members have been about Medicare for all since the end of the Bernie campaign. Did 68,000 people a year stop dying from a lack of health insurance, or did it just become uncool to talk about it now that we're outside of a fundraising cycle? Now, some of us, fearful that exactly this would happen, rallied over the holidays in 2020, staffing phone trees and calling progressive Congress members furiously about the plan and even planning rallies. As left media figures debated the merits of the plan, people like David Sirota offered constructive additions to the ask, including a suggestion that Pelosi be forced to oust corporate Democrat Richie Neal from the Ways and Means Committee, where he was poised to stop progress on health care reform. What should be clear is the specifics of the ask were much less important than the following fact. Nancy Pelosi was obviously an enemy to the left and should not have been voted for without gaining something significant in return. After AOC's first notable day in Congress, during which she protested with climate activists in Pelosi's office, the longtime speaker made quick work of bullying the squad members into submission. An iron fist and a Gucci glove is how Politico described Pelosi once. And over the course of their first 2 years in Congress, the squad members largely submitted to said fist. But here was an opportunity to draw attention to the corruption that paid for that proverbial Gucci glove. The squad members could have demanded important committee assignments. As the current rebel Republicans have done, they could have forced a vote on banning stock trading by Congress members. After all, Pelosi's personal wealth has ballooned during her decades in office, widely out of proportion to her congressional salary. This is a woman who famously defended congressional stock trading despite the clear conflict of interest and insider knowledge Congress members possess. This is a woman who just presided over the quiet death of a bill to end congressional stock trading, one that was arguably designed to fail in the first place. But instead of choosing that moment to fight, to highlight the corruption of the Democratic Party, and to lead a genuine populist movement that stood a chance of waking people up to the limitations of the two-party duopoly, something curious happened. A call seemed to go out to leading figures in the progressive media that they should drop Force the Vote. Although I first heard of the idea from Sam Seder, host of the YouTube show Majority Report, who said he supported Jimmy Dore's idea despite having a long-standing feud with Jimmy. He quickly changed his tune, alluding to a call he'd received that discouraged this approach. A call from whom? We could only guess. The legacy left media all quickly turned against the idea, with large accounts like the Young Turks, Majority Report, and others spreading outright misinformation about the risks of what might happen if the squad declined to vote for Nancy Pelosi. They repeatedly claimed, wrongly, that Kevin McCarthy would become Speaker of the House by default. Of course, as we all saw yesterday and today, that was never true. Hakeem Jeffries is not magically Speaker of the House, despite earning more votes in the first count than McCarthy did yesterday. You need a majority of the House, not just a bare majority, to be Speaker. And yet the lie was so pervasive that Pramila Jayapal herself lied directly to former Rising host Ryan Grimm's face when he asked her during an interview why she voted for Nancy Pelosi without demanding real concessions.
Now, there were some pundits and left-wing media personalities ahead of this vote who were urging the CPC to use the vote for Speaker as leverage to extract a floor vote on Medicare for All. Why didn't the CPC end up taking that particular route?
Well, I'm sympathetic, obviously, as the lead sponsor of the bill, to people who are frustrated that we have not moved to a single-payer system yet. But the reality is that this is a very slim margin. The vote for Speaker was between Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi, and throwing the entire chamber into chaos would have been very detrimental for the Electoral College vote and everything else.
I later confronted Ryan about his failure to push back against Jayapal's claim on my podcast, and we had a constructive conversation about how things could have been handled differently. But since squad members rarely open themselves up to questioning from anyone in progressive media outside of Ryan Grimm at The Intercept, that missed opportunity was one that carried the lie that Kevin McCarthy could become Speaker if Democrats force the vote far and wide. Sam Seder was one of the most vocal opponents to force the vote. After, of course, he supported it. And following a 3-hour debate with me on my podcast, it was incredibly demoralizing to hear that he did not understand the basic facts of how the congressional vote even worked. I recommend everyone go and listen to that debate at Bad Faith if you haven't watched it already. Now, all of this was as obvious as the nose on my face 2 years ago. But major left media figures like Sam have been loud and wrong about this for years without any apology. This issue became the source of a major fissure in left politics. For years, I've been the subject of personal attacks from opponents of Force the Vote. Sam, for one, argued after a debate, which ended on a friendly note, that I, quote, yelled at him for 3 hours, while Cenk Uygur referred to me as a fake leftist just 6 months or so ago, in part because of my advocacy for Force the Vote and my perceived alliance with Jimmy Dore, who shared my support of this particular tactic. Now, of course, both the left media and mainstream media are perfectly clear on how all this works now that there's no pressure on progressives to actually be adversarial to the Democratic Party, outside, of course, wearing tax the rich sweatshirts. Now they get it. But while Democrats are bending over backward to pretend that the Force the Vote strategy is emblematic of a Republican Party in disarray, what this moment really shows is how fully controlled by the corporate Democratic Party progressive Democrats really are. What the rogue Republicans are fighting for now is not what I would have asked for. But the point is that progressives in 2021 could have asked for anything. My former colleague Ryan Grimm, along with progressives like AOC and Pramila Jayapal, bragged back then about securing relatively minor procedural changes like PAYGO exemptions. They lauded these gains so much, you would have thought that PAYGO was Esperanto for student debt cancellation, a $15 minimum wage, or a classic Oprah car giveaway. In 2021, these progressives celebrated wins much smaller than the wins already secured by the Republican holdouts this week. But now they're taking smug selfies from the House floor, as though McCarthy's concessions aren't proof that they gave up an enormous amount of leverage without a fight 2 years ago. And for what? What happened after they decided to play the game and make nice with Mama Bear? AOC tweeted that she wouldn't be forcing the vote because she was negotiating on the inside for committee appointments and was reserving leverage to fight for a $15 minimum wage. But how did that go, AOC? Biden and the corporate Dems killed the $15 minimum wage when Schumer stripped it from must-pass COVID legislation that only needed a bare majority to pass, converting a 51-vote issue into a filibuster-proof vote. And it was reported that Pramila Jayapal whipped votes to make sure the progressives didn't threaten to vote down the COVID relief bill in protest. I guess that sort of move is only allowed if you're Manchin or Sinema fighting for corporations, not progressives fighting for the people. Moreover, squad members ended up with even worse committee assignments than they'd had the previous year. Katie Porter was kicked off the Financial Services Committee, reportedly because her popular whiteboard presentations exposing corporate corruption made it tougher for Committee Chair Maxine Waters to do the real work of the Financial Services Committee, that is, fundraising from Wall Street. And this is what is so absolutely disappointing about progressives. It's why so many people who were once willing to fight with Bernie are no longer willing to engage in electoral politics at all. It has become clear that as performative and goofy as some of the right posturing is right now, people like Matt Gaetz are still willing to demonstrate more fight against the establishment of their own party than squad members who once claimed that they'd rather be one-term Congress members than forego their principles. Take a listen.
Today, humble to a fault, maybe the right person for the job of Speaker of the House isn't someone who wants it so bad. Maybe the right person for the job of Speaker of the House isn't someone who has sold shares of themselves for more than a decade to get it. Maybe Jim Jordan is the right person for Speaker of the House because he is not beholden to the lobbyists and special interests who have corrupted this place and corrupted this nation under the leadership of both Republicans and Democrats.
Now, Matt Gaetz was talking about Kevin McCarthy there, but he easily could have been talking about Nancy Pelosi. The difference is you won't hear a peep out of the squad about Nancy Pelosi's corruption, her unpopularity, or the fact that after a 30-year reign, she's allowed to choose her own successor without any real contest occurring whatsoever, even from the progressive flank. We're learning today that Force the Vote works. It comes with media backlash, but it is, in fact, an effective mechanism that can be used to get a whole range of important concessions and deliver for the people, if people choose. That being the case, every single person who opposed it in 2021 has to answer the question: was bending the knee really worth it? So I know that's a lot, Robbie, but this is my bugaboo. And it is really cringe for me to watch progressives as they are getting a front row seat to how much they could have tried to wrest from Pelosi 2 years ago in this exact same situation, for them to be smug and mocking of what's going on right now, instead of realizing that this could have been power, this was power that they in fact held in their hands and they just squandered.
100%. The smugness is so uncalled for. It's telling that they don't understand how obnoxious that smugness is to the people who voted the squad members in. The mainstream media is smug about this because they love the popcorn.gif of it all. Mm-hmm. And your AOC types are playing into that now because they're captured by it. It is wild. Republicans are doing what you wanted your side to do for so long. That said, the difference is I don't actually believe that there's much at stake policy-wise here. It sounds like there was something at stake policy-wise on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, this is all personal. Yeah. This is a clash of personalities, people who don't like Kevin McCarthy. I don't believe that there's much difference between if any difference between Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise. Completely substantively. Agree. They have different personalities. Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to bat for Kevin McCarthy right now, and she just laid into Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert and Chip Roy and a bunch of other people. And I'm listening to her, and I've indicated that I'm not necessarily a fan of Marjorie Taylor Greene, but I'm listening to her, and everything she says is 100% correct. Yeah. She's like, they're all hypocrites. Right. Matt Gaetz supported Paul Ryan. Chip Roy didn't go far enough in terms of MAGA direction regarding January 6th.
Boebert took money.
Yeah, they were all, so now to object, but they weren't doing, they're not, what she's pointing out is none of them are perfect. So you're saying Kevin McCarthy's not perfect, none of you are perfect. Right. And at this point, there's no, so anyway, it's wild.
Yeah, I completely agree. The ideological priors are all over the place. I don't think, the problem isn't not having a plan for an alternative speaker. The problem is not having a plan for what you want to actually get out of this, so that the people you're negotiating with have a feeling that there's an end point to this and that it is worth coming to the negotiating table. That being said, Democrats could have chosen anything. Progressives had a long laundry list of things that they had basically given up as soon as Joe Biden, who was perhaps the most conservative person in the Democratic Party, was able to consolidate the moderates and win. And instead of making any of those demands, even small ones like, hey, what if we have an immediate sign student debt cancellation immediately, since that's something that can be done by executive order. Had Biden done that, wouldn't have given the opening for the courts to challenge in the way that they've done, and he'd be in a very different posture on a major policy promise that he made in 2020. They chose to do nothing and to brag about things like pay-go maneuvers and the anticipated seats that they would get on various committees that never came through, and set those little things up as important at the same time that they're dismissing significant concessions that these holdout Republicans have already made. I can't get over it. There's a lot of backlash, I want to say. The media backlash is real, and that was completely anticipated by the people who were pushing Force the Vote back in 2021. But the question is it worth it to you to help to try to make the public understand how much they're getting screwed over by corporate Democrats and Republicans alike?
Very interesting. All right, well, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.